Hey guys, okay, so this time we're going to talk about supply-side fiscal policy, and supply-side fiscal policy is basically it's known as something like Reaganomics or trickle-down economics, and it's built around the idea of dealing with stagflation, which is that abnormal contraction, and I've talked about this, but I'm just going to say it again. Stagflation is that abnormal contraction where you have both high inflation, so high prices, and high unemployment. So people aren't working anyway, so they couldn't afford anything, right? And cost push inflation combined with contractionary decline and unemployment really is a detrimental to our economy. It's very hard to deal with. So what's actually happening is that aggregate supply is decreasing, and it's caused most often by increasing businesses' input costs. So their input costs go up. And remember, just like those non-price determinants, if your input costs go up, it's more expensive to produce, therefore your total supply goes down because you're trying to mitigate the effects of those input costs. So what's going to happen is your aggregate supply curve is going to shift left. So, for example, and I talked about this in an earlier video, but for example, increasing oil costs led to increased general costs of production for all businesses. So trucking and anything that uses gas, plastic making, anything that uses oil, not gas, oil. Suppliers are going to go ahead and raise prices, so there's your inflation, but because of slow growth, they're also going to have to lay off employees. So supply-side fiscal policy is based on Say's law, and Say's law states that supply creates its own demand. So if you make it, they will buy it, that kind of thing. And so supply-side fiscal policy is designed to stimulate aggregate supply. And this is why it's also known as Reaganomics or trickle-down economics, is because you are giving like tax cuts and you're giving benefits to business owners and suppliers as opposed to consumers. Demand-side fiscal policy is focused on consumption and on consumers, whereas supply side is based on producers and suppliers. So by doing that, these people are the job creators, right? They're the money makers, the risk takers, the business owners. So, and then they get the benefits, and then it trickles down to all the other levels. Now, whether or not that's actually what happens, that's up to you. You need to decide. But let's talk about the tools, because we've talked about the tools with other ones. And the tools of supply-side fiscal policy, you need to remember the 3 Ds. All right? You have to decrease business taxes, decrease government regulation, and decrease government spending. All right, so notice all of that really helps the businesses. And the major goals of this is that it's going to fight inflation. Why are there no quiet places in this school? It's going to fight inflation by increasing the supply of goods, while at the same time, it's going to fight unemployment by providing businesses with incentives to increase production. And if you increase production, then you need more workers. And if you have more workers, you expand the job market and unemployment goes down. Yay! Right? Okay. So at this point, the goal is to increase aggregate supply. Shift that aggregate supply curve to the right, because right is raise, which will in turn increase real GDP, showing economic growth. It'll bring the price level down, and it'll fight unemployment. So it solves both problems of stagflation, high unemployment and high inflation. Unfortunately, there are some limitations of supply-side fiscal policy. It means that there is decreased government revenue, so budget deficits and fewer government programs. There is major income inequality. In the 80s, when they actually used this, the gap between the wealthy and the poor grew huge, and the middle class almost disappeared. I mean, policy really does help the wealthiest greatly, moderately helps the middle class, and really hurts the poor. because spending in reality did not trickle down. It only got so far. And with deregulation of industry, it's beneficial to the economy in the short run. It actually creates negative externalities, meaning unsafe working conditions, environmental pollution, and long term, it has led to the collapse of a few very huge industries like the savings and loans industry, which will collapse in '87, the housing market, banking regulations, all of that stuff it'll lead to collapses. So when you remove those regulations, sometimes it does have detrimental effects. So you need to decide, go now to see the fight between John Maynard Keynes, who is the guy who came up with demand-side fiscal policy, and Friedrich Hayek, who is the economic philosopher who really thought up supply-side fiscal policy, and see them duke it out in those videos that are down below.